James Campbell sat at his desk, the glow of his computer screen reflecting in his glasses as he stared at the lines of code that seemed to blur together. His thoughts were elsewhere. He had spent the last several weeks pouring his heart into his side project, hoping that his idea could make a real difference. But no matter how hard he tried, there was always something holding him back. He had always been the one who had to prove himself, working twice as hard to get half the recognition. Being one of the only black programmers at a tech company that prided itself on innovation should have been an opportunity. But more often than not, it felt like a burden. He had pitched his big idea to Leah Thompson, the head of the development team, just a few days ago. The idea was simple: a platform that used AI to match startups with investors in real time. Instead of the typical, slow and drawn-out process of applying for funding, this platform would automatically analyze pitches, business models, and even personality traits of potential investors to match them with the most suitable startups. It wasn't just innovative, it was revolutionary. Leah had listened with a quiet expression, her eyes scanning the pitch he had worked on tirelessly. She had asked a few questions, but her answers were vague, evasive. He had waited for the usual response, the one he had been expecting for weeks. The one that would confirm his fears about how little people at the company trusted his abilities, how little faith they had in his ideas. "I don't know, James," Leah had said, finally breaking the silence. "It's a good concept, but I think it's a bit risky for the scope of this project. Maybe we should stick with something more traditional for now. We're on tight deadlines, and we need something that's guaranteed to work." James had felt his stomach twist. He had heard this before, the talk about safety, about sticking to what was familiar. He had become all too familiar with these words. People didn't trust new ideas, especially when those ideas came from someone like him, someone who didn't fit the typical mold of a tech entrepreneur. "I understand," James had said, his voice measured. He had to keep calm, to play the part of the humble employee. "But I really believe this could be the next big thing for the industry. Investors are moving faster, and this could give us a competitive edge." Leah had nodded, though her eyes were already drifting to Ryan Mitchell, the senior developer who was known for his reliability. Ryan had been with the company longer than anyone. He was competent, but he never dreamed big. He never tried to change the game. And yet, it was Ryan who Leah turned to when it came time to decide who would take charge of this new project. She had smiled and said, "Ryan, I think you're the one who should take the lead on this." James had nodded, swallowing his disappointment. "Of course, Leah." Leah hadn't even looked back at him. She had moved on to the next agenda item. That was it. Ryan would be in charge, and James's idea would remain just that. An idea. Unnoticed. Unimportant. But James wasn't the kind of person to back down easily. He had spent years being underestimated, being overlooked, and he had learned one thing along the way. If you wanted to succeed, you had to make your own opportunities. So, he began working on his idea in secret. He started coding at night, using his free time to build a prototype. He didn't ask for help. He didn't wait for permission. He just worked. And every line of code he wrote felt like a small rebellion against the doubt that had been cast upon him. James spent every evening and weekend working on his side project. It wasn't easy. Sometimes it felt like he was living in two worlds. During the day, he would go through the motions at work, attending meetings, writing code for his assigned tasks, always with the knowledge that his big idea was waiting in the wings, unfinished. He had to fight against the temptation to just give up, to let go of the dream and accept that some people would never see him for what he was truly capable of. But he couldn't. His mind wouldn't let him. One morning, during their usual coffee break, he found himself sitting across from Hannah Wilson, a young analyst at the company who had always been friendly to him. Hannah was eager to learn, and although she didn't have much experience with coding, she was always asking questions about the business side of things. She seemed genuinely interested in his thoughts on the tech industry. James had always appreciated her curiosity. "Hey, James," Hannah said one day as they sat at the small kitchen table, both of them sipping their coffee. "What's this new app I've heard you're working on?" James hesitated, feeling a flicker of uncertainty. He wasn't sure how much he should reveal. After all, it was supposed to be a secret, something he didn't want anyone in the company to know about yet. But something about Hannah's open, honest demeanor made him decide to tell her. "I'm building a platform for startups and investors," he said, lowering his voice so no one else could hear. "It's an app that connects startups with potential investors using an algorithm to match them based on business goals, compatibility, even personality. Instead of waiting months for a deal to come through, the system connects the right people immediately." Hannah's eyes widened with interest. "That sounds amazing. It could totally change the way startups get funded, right? I mean, there are so many barriers in the traditional investment process. James felt a surge of relief. Finally, someone understood. Finally, someone didn't just see him as another developer. Someone saw the potential in his idea. I think so, James said, his voice tinged with excitement. But I'm doing this on my own. It's just a side project right now, but I really think it could be big. Hannah smiled. Well, if you ever need help with anything, like market research or analyzing trends, I'm happy to pitch in. I might not know much about coding, but I'm pretty good at digging into the numbers. James blinked, surprised by her offer. You'd really help? Of course, she said, her smile widening. I think it's a great idea, and I'm not going to sit by while you do all the hard work. We could totally make this a success together. For the first time in what felt like forever, James felt a genuine sense of hope. Maybe he wasn't entirely alone in this after all. Maybe, just maybe, he had someone on his side. As James continued to build the app, he knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. But one thing had become clear. He wasn't going to let anyone define what he could or couldn't do. This was his chance to prove himself, not just to his colleagues, but to the entire tech world. He had an idea that could change the game, and he was determined to see it through, no matter what. The only question now was, would the world be ready for what he had to offer? James threw himself into his side project with renewed determination. The quiet hum of the office became a background to the rhythm of his thoughts, and every spare moment was spent coding. With the help of Hannah, he began to shape his idea into something tangible. She had been invaluable, not only with market research and trend analysis, but also as a sounding board when James needed someone to listen to his frustrations. Slowly, his project began to take form. But as the days turned into weeks, James found that the road wasn't as smooth as he had hoped. There were nights when the code wouldn't work, when an algorithm would malfunction, or when the idea itself felt too ambitious, too complex to bring to life. It was during these moments of doubt that James would look at the clock, realize it was past midnight, and force himself to push through. Hannah's support, though, never wavered. She often stayed late with him, reviewing business models or digging through market reports to make sure the app would be aligned with what investors were currently looking for. You've got something here, James, she would tell him, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. I mean, it's risky, sure, but it could be exactly what the market needs right now. Investors are looking for ways to cut down on time spent on initial meetings, and this could give them that. It wasn't easy for James to maintain his confidence, especially when Leah's dismissive attitude about his idea still stung. Leah had been polite about it. She never outright rejected him, but the look in her eyes and the subtle gestures had spoken volumes. Ryan Mitchell, the senior developer, was an easy choice for Leah. She didn't have to worry about him taking too many risks. And yet, despite the dismissals, despite the doubts, James couldn't help but feel a spark of hope each time he saw the app's progress. Late one evening, after another long day at the office, James and Hannah sat at a small coffee shop down the street, their laptops open in front of them. The cafe was mostly empty at this hour, with only the barista cleaning the counter and a few late-night patrons tapping away at their own work. James took a deep breath, stretching his fingers before cracking his knuckles. It had been a long day, but the app was starting to take shape. I think we're getting closer, James said, staring at the code on his screen. The AI's algorithm is starting to improve. It's more accurate now when it comes to matching startups with the right investors. I can tell. I've been reviewing the data, and I think it's going to be a hit in the market, Hannah replied, her eyes lighting up as she spoke. If we market this right, we can make some serious noise. James grinned, feeling a sense of excitement that had been absent for months. He had been so focused on the technical aspects that he hadn't realized just how much potential his idea had in the business world. It wasn't just a tool for startups, it was a tool for investors too. If it worked, it could completely reshape the way the investment world functioned. Do you think we can get it off the ground? He asked, his voice quieter now. Hannah smiled, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. It's going to be tough, but I think with the right backing it could work. I mean, the industry needs this. There's always a bottleneck in the process, right? Startups pitching their ideas, investors looking for the right ones. This would speed up the process. And once investors see how well it works, it's going to be hard for them to say no. Her words filled James with a quiet determination. He knew the next step would be the hardest. It was time to take his idea beyond his small circle and get some real attention. But the thought of doing this on his own was intimidating. What if they were wrong? What if the app didn't perform as expected? What if the risks were too high? I'm still not sure if it's ready, James admitted, leaning back in his chair. It's so close, but there are still some bugs. I'm worried that once it's out there, it won't live up to the hype. Hannah reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. James, you've worked so hard on this. It's a risk, sure, but sometimes you have to take risks to get ahead. I've seen what this app can do, and I think we can make it happen. You just need the right partners. James stared at her for a moment, feeling a warmth spread through him. She was right. This was his dream, his creation, and he couldn't let fear hold him back. But there was still so much to do. He needed a plan, a strategy, a way to get investors interested in something they hadn't seen before. The next morning, James woke up early, his mind racing with ideas. He had made the decision. If he wanted to get this off the ground, he needed a meeting with someone who could take him seriously, someone who could help him push the project forward. And that meant reaching out to Mark Anderson, the CEO of the company. James had never spoken to Mark directly about his idea, but he knew the CEO's reputation. Mark wasn't one to shy away from big risks. He was the kind of businessman who was always looking for the next big thing. If James could show him the potential of his app, maybe, just maybe, he could get the backing he needed. After a few calls and emails, Mark agreed to meet with James. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. James entered the sleek, modern conference room with a mix of excitement and anxiety. He had prepared for this moment for days, putting together a pitch that would showcase the app's potential and explain why it was different from anything else on the market. He had worked through the possible objections Mark might have, crafting answers to any concerns. When Mark walked in, he exuded confidence, his tailored suit, sharp features, and calm demeanor making him look every bit the part of a Silicon Valley mogul. He was a man who had built an empire, who made quick decisions that often paid off in ways others couldn't predict. James felt a wave of respect, but also intimidation, wash over him. "James," Mark said, offering a handshake. "Let's get started. I've heard a lot of good things about your work. I'm curious to hear more about your app." James cleared his throat, setting up his laptop. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me. I know you've got a lot on your plate, but I believe this app could be a game changer for the industry. It's a platform that helps connect investors with startups in real time, using an AI-driven algorithm to match the right investors with the right startups based on compatibility and business goals." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Sounds interesting. But what makes it different from the other pitch platforms out there?" James leaned forward. "It's not just about matching based on business models. It's about creating a real-time connection that's personalized. We're not just putting a bunch of pitches into a database and hoping something sticks. The app learns from each interaction and improves over time." Mark listened closely, his expression unreadable. When James finished, he paused for a long moment, as if weighing his words. "You've got something here," Mark said slowly, his eyes never leaving James's. "But you've also got a lot of work ahead of you. This is a big leap, James. Are you sure you're ready for it?" James nodded, his voice steady. "I'm ready, and I believe in this idea." Mark smiled, leaning back in his chair. "I'll tell you what, I'm willing to invest, but I want to see a prototype. I need to know this thing can really work. If it does, we'll talk about scaling it up." James felt a wave of relief wash over him, mixed with a rush of excitement. This was his chance. The risk was still there, but now, it was a risk he was willing to take. As James left the meeting, he couldn't contain his excitement. He had secured the first step toward making his dream a reality. But he knew this was only the beginning. There was still so much to be done, and the road ahead would be filled with obstacles. But for the first time in a long time, James felt like he was on the right path. He was no longer just the overlooked programmer in the corner. He was a force to be reckoned with. And no one, not Leah, not Ryan, not even the industry itself, could take that away from him. James spent the next several days working relentlessly. The meeting with Mark had been a turning point, one that fueled his resolve to make the app a success. Now, with the promise of investment on the table, there was no time to waste. He and Hannah dove deeper into the development, making tweaks to the algorithm, ironing out the bugs, and ensuring the user interface was clean and intuitive. As the days blurred together, James found himself losing track of time. He would wake up at 6, check his email, work on the prototype for a few hours, and then head to the office, where he would push through his usual tasks. Each day, he spent every free moment either coding or strategizing how to pitch the app to potential investors. And every evening he would meet with Hannah at their favorite cafe, continuing the work late into the night. Though the technical aspects of the app were getting smoother, the tension still lingered. James knew that just because Mark had agreed to invest didn't mean success was guaranteed. There were so many variables at play: the market's response, the competition, and, perhaps most importantly, whether the app could deliver the kind of results that would convince investors to come on board. A week after his meeting with Mark, the pressure began to mount. James found himself sitting in the office late one evening, staring at his screen. The prototype was almost ready, but there were still some final details to work out. It felt like everything depended on this moment. If the app didn't work as promised, if the algorithm wasn't as efficient as it needed to be, all of his hard work would go to waste. "Hey, James!" a voice called from the doorway, pulling him from his thoughts. He turned to see Leah standing there, holding a cup of coffee. She had a faint smile on her face, but there was something about her expression that made James's stomach tighten. "Leah," he said, offering a polite smile as he leaned back in his chair. "What's up?" Leah stepped into the room, looking at the screen behind him. "I've been meaning to catch up with you," she said, her tone more cordial than usual. "I've heard some things around the office. People are talking about your project." James couldn't help but feel a wave of anxiety wash over him. "What are they saying?" "Oh, nothing bad," she said quickly, holding up a hand. "Just that, well, I didn't realize how far you'd come with it." "I've been hearing some pretty impressive things from some of the other developers. Ryan said the algorithm is getting better every day." James felt a mix of pride and disbelief. Ryan? The same Ryan who had been handed the project instead of him? "Yeah," James said, choosing his words carefully. "We've been working really hard on it." Leah nodded, but her eyes lingered on the screen, studying the lines of code as if they held the answers to some unasked question. "It looks like you've got something here, James. I mean, I didn't know you had it in you. You've really pulled this off." James's heart raced as he tried to keep his voice steady. "Thanks, Leah. That means a lot." There was a brief silence before Leah cleared her throat. "You know, I've been thinking. Maybe we could work together on this. I'm not saying I'm in a position to officially help, but I could offer some guidance. I think you've got something really special here. It's just a matter of getting it to the right people." Her words caught James off guard. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. After everything that had happened, after being passed over for the project, hearing Leah say this felt complicated. But he knew it wasn't the time to dwell on past decisions. He had a bigger goal in mind now. "I appreciate the offer, Leah," he said finally, "but I think I'm better off running with this myself. I've got Mark's attention, and I'm confident we can make this work." Leah nodded slowly, her lips pressed together in thought. "I understand, but if you ever need help or advice, just know I'm here." With that, she turned and left the room, leaving James alone with his thoughts. A few days later, James received an email that nearly made his heart stop. It was from Mark Anderson, the CEO. The subject line simply read, "We're in." He clicked on the email, reading through Mark's message with a growing sense of disbelief. It wasn't just that Mark had agreed to fund the project. It was that he was committing more resources than James had anticipated. Mark wanted a full-scale prototype in 2 weeks. If it delivered on its promises, they would start discussing scaling the product and moving toward a larger investment round. This was real. This was happening. James could barely contain his excitement. He called Hannah immediately, eager to share the news. "Hannah, Mark just emailed me. He's in. He wants a prototype ready in 2 weeks." Hannah's voice was full of enthusiasm. "That's amazing, James. I knew you could do it." "This is your chance." James leaned back in his chair, a grin spreading across his face. "I can't believe it. I thought we still had more time to get things perfect, but now it's real. We need to deliver." The next few days were a whirlwind. James, Hannah, and a few trusted developers from the office worked non-stop to finalize the prototype. They encountered a few glitches here and there, but nothing that couldn't be fixed. There was no room for error. This was the moment James had been working for his entire career. As the deadline loomed closer, tension hung thick in the air. They were in constant communication with Mark and his team, updating them on the progress and working on improvements where necessary. It was a race against time, but the team was driven, fueled by the knowledge that they were on the brink of something monumental. The day of the presentation arrived. James stood in front of Mark, several other investors, and a few key players from the company. His palms were sweaty, his heart pounding, but he knew that this was his moment. Everything he had worked for had led to this. "Good morning, everyone," James began, his voice steady but quiet. "Today, I'm going to show you something that I believe will change the way the startup world functions. It's not just an app. It's an entirely new way to connect investors and entrepreneurs in real time. He clicked a button, and the screen behind him flickered to life, showing the sleek interface of the app. Investors began typing in their preferences. Startups submitted their business pitches, and within seconds, the app started making real-time matches. The algorithm scanned through the information, matching startups with investors who were most likely to be interested in their vision, business model, and even their personal style. As the demo progressed, James watched the investors' reactions closely. There was a visible shift in the room. The murmurs of approval started to grow, and James could feel the energy change. This was more than just a technical success. It was exactly what the market needed. When the demo ended, Mark Anderson stood up first, his expression one of approval. "James," he said, his voice carrying authority, "you've done it. This is exactly what we've been looking for. We'll move forward with the investment. I'm confident in this project." James's heart soared as the investors around the room began nodding in agreement. The hard work, the late nights, the doubts, all of it had paid off. For the first time, he felt like he truly belonged in this world. This was his moment. In the weeks that followed, the project gained momentum. James was no longer the overlooked programmer. He was the face of a revolutionary new platform. The media began to take notice, with journalists like Sophia Hill covering the success story. The app, which had once been just an idea, was now a recognized product. But even as his success grew, James knew the journey was far from over. There were still risks to navigate, competitors to outsmart, and new challenges to face. But now, with the support of Mark, Hannah, and a growing team, he was ready to take on whatever came next. The startup world was big and unpredictable, but James was no longer just a bystander. He was a player, and he had only just begun. James woke up to the sound of his phone vibrating on the nightstand. Groggy and still half-dazed from a restless sleep, he reached for it, blinking at the screen. It was an email from Mark Anderson. Again. The subject line simply read, "We need to talk." His heart skipped a beat. Mark had already invested, and they had gone through the initial stages of planning for the app's rollout. What could this be about? With a sigh, James rubbed his eyes and opened the email. "James, we've had some discussions here about the upcoming phase. I need you to meet me tomorrow, along with a few other key people. There are some adjustments we need to make. Let's talk through the next steps." James's stomach tightened. Was something wrong? Had they changed their minds? He had worked so hard to get this far. He couldn't afford to have it all fall apart now. A feeling of unease gnawed at him as he pushed the covers aside and swung his feet onto the floor. He couldn't afford to lose his focus. Not now. It was time to step up and show that he wasn't just a programmer or a developer. He was a leader. The meeting the next day was tense. Mark had invited two other investors, Olivia Brown and Nathan Harris, both known for their sharp instincts in the startup world. They were key players, people whose decisions could make or break a project like his. As James walked into the conference room, he tried to steady his breathing, keeping his posture confident despite the pounding of his heart. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let this moment slip through his fingers. Mark was seated at the head of the table, and he greeted James with a nod. Olivia and Nathan sat on either side of him, their expressions unreadable. "James," Mark began, after a brief exchange of pleasantries, "we're very impressed with what you've accomplished so far. The prototype is solid, but there's something I think we need to address before we move forward." James clenched his jaw but nodded. He had prepared for this moment. The stakes were high, but he knew he had to remain calm, no matter what. "We've been getting feedback from some of our contacts in the investor world," Mark continued. "They love the idea behind the app. Connecting startups with investors in real time is exactly what the market needs. But we've got some concerns about scaling. The current version of the app might not be able to handle the volume of startups and investors once we push it out there." James felt a flash of panic rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I understand the concerns, Mark, but we've built it to scale. It's all about optimizing the algorithm to handle more data as it comes in. I can work on improving the infrastructure and make sure the backend supports higher traffic. We'll have it ready for a larger rollout." Nathan, the quieter of the two investors, leaned forward slightly. "But how fast can you make those changes, James? This isn't just about fixing bugs. We're talking about a major overhaul. We need to be sure it's going to work before we scale it. We're talking about a global market here." James swallowed. The pressure was mounting. He had always prided himself on being able to handle stress, but this felt different. The people around the table weren't just colleagues. They were his future. "I can get it done," James said, his voice steady even though his mind was racing. "I'll prioritize the back-end improvements and focus on optimizing the data processing capabilities. We'll need to bring in additional infrastructure engineers to help, but we can handle it." Olivia raised an eyebrow, her lips pressed together. "And what about the customer-facing side of things? We can't afford any issues with the user experience once we go live. If people can't access the platform quickly or the interface is clunky, the whole project is a bust." James took a deep breath. "I've been working closely with the design team, and we've already mapped out the changes. The goal is to keep things intuitive while adding the new features to handle a larger user base. I can oversee the improvements on both ends, making sure the performance and interface align." Mark sat back, his fingers steepled. "I appreciate your confidence, James, but there's another issue we need to discuss. Our competitors are catching on. There are a few apps in development that are trying to tackle the same market, and some of them have much larger teams behind them. We need to be first to market with a fully functional, scalable product if we want to maintain the edge." James nodded, absorbing the weight of Mark's words. This wasn't just about perfecting his app. It was about beating the competition to market, about getting the product into the hands of investors and entrepreneurs before anyone else could. "This is a race," Olivia said, her voice cold and calculating. "You've got the concept, James, but now you need to execute, and execute fast. If you're not ready to roll this out in the next 6 months, we'll lose our chance." 6 months, that was the new deadline. James knew it was going to be a challenge, one of the biggest he'd ever faced, but it was one he couldn't afford to fail. "I'll make it happen," James said, his voice firm. "I've already started working on the changes. I'll get the infrastructure scaled, and I'll ensure that the user experience is smooth. I'll deliver." Mark smiled, though there was no warmth behind it. "Good. We'll be counting on you, James. We're all in on this, but you've got to prove that you can deliver." For the next few weeks, James was consumed by the task at hand. The pressure to meet the 6-month deadline was suffocating, but it only fueled his determination. He worked through weekends, barely sleeping, pushing himself harder than he ever had before. There were moments when he felt like he might break, moments when the sheer weight of it all threatened to crush him. But each time he felt himself falter, he thought back to the meeting with Mark and the others. He thought about how far he had come and how much was riding on his ability to deliver. This wasn't just about building an app anymore. This was about proving himself, not just to Mark and the investors, but to everyone who had ever doubted him. And that included himself. Hannah remained by his side, offering support both in terms of market analysis and emotional encouragement. She had become his rock during this chaotic time, always offering insight, always keeping him grounded when the pressure became unbearable. She was a constant source of motivation when the nights seemed endless. One evening, as James sat hunched over his desk, coding frantically, Hannah came into his office and stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. "James," she said softly, "you're burning yourself out. You need to take a break. It's been weeks." James didn't even look up from the screen. "I can't afford to. We have a deadline." "You're not going to hit the deadline if you're half dead, James," she replied, her voice stern but caring. "You're doing great, but you need to rest. I'll stay here with you tonight if that helps, but you have to promise me you'll take care of yourself." He finally looked up at her, the exhaustion clear in his eyes. For a moment he just stared, unsure of what to say. But then, something in her gaze broke through the fog of his exhaustion. "Okay," he said softly, his shoulders slumping. "Okay, I'll take a break." Hannah smiled, walking over to him and giving him a quick, reassuring hug. "You've got this, James. You always have." The next few months were a blur of late nights, progress meetings, and rapid changes. As the team worked to scale the app, the competition in the market grew fierce. James couldn't afford distractions. Every decision, every line of code, had to be perfect. But with each passing day, the pressure mounted. The success of the project now felt like it was out of his hands. He had done everything he could. It was now up to the app to perform. Mark's deadline was looming ever closer. James knew that if he could just get the app to function as promised, if the infrastructure could handle the influx of users, he would succeed. But that was still a huge if. Every time they tested the app, there were new issues. Some were minor, others much more critical. And with each setback, James's anxiety grew. Yet despite the setbacks, James never stopped pushing. The finish line was within reach, and he couldn't allow himself to lose focus now. James sat at his desk, staring at the screen in front of him, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The hum of his laptop seemed like the only sound in the room as he typed in the final adjustments to the code. It had been a long road, filled with sleepless nights, growing stress, and moments of doubt. But now, as the clock ticked down to the final hours before their demo, there was a sense of finality in the air. The app, once just an idea, had grown into something bigger than he had ever imagined. But with the size and complexity of the project came a magnitude of responsibility he could hardly wrap his mind around. Every line of code, every algorithm, every feature had to be flawless. Anything less, and the entire venture could collapse before it even had a chance to take off. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Mark. "We're all set for tomorrow's demo. Let's make sure everything's ready. Investors will be watching." The pressure was unbearable. James ran his fingers through his hair, trying to stave off the fatigue creeping in. He hadn't slept properly in days. Hannah had been a steady presence, helping him with market data, refining the user experience, and ensuring that everything functioned smoothly. She had been invaluable, and James was grateful for her dedication. But even she could sense his exhaustion. "James," she said one night, walking into his office, her voice firm but caring. "You need to step away for a bit. You're not going to get this done if you're running on empty. Let's take a walk, get some fresh air." James shook his head, staring at the screen. "I can't. We're so close, Hannah. If we don't nail this demo tomorrow, everything we've worked for will be for nothing." Hannah crossed her arms and stood in the doorway. "You've been working nonstop for weeks. You need to rest. You're too important to burn out now. Do you really think you're going to do your best work if you're running on fumes?" James exhaled heavily. He knew she was right, but the thought of stepping away, even for a few minutes, felt like surrender. He was so close to the finish line. If he could just keep pushing for a little longer, he might be able to do it. But Hannah's concern was evident. "Just a break," she insisted gently, "and I'll stay with you to go over the final touches. You're not alone in this." He finally relented, standing up and following her outside. The night air felt cold against his face, and the silence of the streets was a welcome change. For the first time in weeks, James felt his shoulders relax. He had been so wrapped up in the work, so focused on the end goal, that he had forgotten to take a step back and breathe. As they walked, Hannah spoke softly, her voice cutting through the quiet. "You've got something great here, James. And even if this demo doesn't go perfectly, it's still a huge accomplishment. You've already proven you can bring this vision to life. No matter what happens tomorrow, don't forget that." James took a deep breath, looking at her with a grateful smile. "Thanks, Hannah. I really needed that." They walked for a little longer, talking about everything and nothing, and by the time they returned to the office, James felt a sense of clarity that had been missing for weeks. He wasn't alone in this. He had a team, people who believed in him and his vision. Together, they could make this work. The next day, the room was packed with investors, tech enthusiasts, and journalists. The energy in the air was electric, but it was also thick with anticipation. James stood at the front of the room, his heart racing, his palms slick with sweat. This was the moment that would define everything he had worked for. This was his chance to show the world what he had built. Mark stood beside him, nodding his approval. The investors were seated at a long table, their expressions serious as they prepared to evaluate the platform James had poured so much of his time and effort into. "You've got this, James," Mark said, offering a rare smile of encouragement. "Just be yourself. Show them why this app is the future." James took a deep breath, adjusted the microphone in front of him, and clicked to start the demo. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his voice steady but tinged with excitement. "Thank you for being here today. I'm excited to show you what we've built. This app is not just a tool for startups. It's a new way to connect investors with businesses, cutting out the traditional barriers that slow down the investment process." He clicked a button, and the screen behind him came to life, showing the sleek, user-friendly interface of the platform. Startups submitted their business pitches, while investors input their preferences. The system worked like magic, matching businesses with investors in real time based on their goals, values, and financial potential. As the demo continued, James could feel the room shift. The investors were no longer just passive observers. They were engaged, asking questions, leaning forward as the app demonstrated its real-time efficiency. "This is the future," one of the investors, Olivia Brown, said, her eyes bright with interest. "This is exactly what the industry has been waiting for." Nathan Harris nodded in agreement. The market is saturated with traditional matchmaking services, but this could change everything. You're not just matching business models, you're matching people. James smiled, his nerves starting to ease as the demo continued. He had worked tirelessly to make sure the app was flawless, and the response he was getting was exactly what he had hoped for. As the presentation concluded, Mark stood and clapped, signaling the end of the demo. The investors followed suit, their applause ringing through the room. "Well done, James," Mark said, his voice full of pride. "You've exceeded our expectations." The investors were already murmuring among themselves, their excitement palpable. It wasn't just that the app worked, it was that it solved a real problem, and the timing was perfect. In a world where startups needed faster, more efficient access to capital, James's app was a game changer. As the room began to empty out, Olivia and Nathan approached James. "We're in," Olivia said without hesitation. "We want to move forward with the investment. Let's talk terms." Nathan smiled. "I'm in too. You've created something truly innovative, James. I've been watching the market for years, and this is exactly what it needs." James felt a rush of adrenaline. This was it, the moment he had worked for. It was more than just the money. It was the validation of his idea, the recognition that his vision had been worth fighting for. "Thank you," James said, his voice full of emotion. "I promise I won't let you down." The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings, contract negotiations, and strategizing for the next phase of the app's rollout. With the investors on board, James had the backing and the resources to scale his project. But there was still so much to do. They needed to refine the user experience, secure partnerships, and push the app into a global market. But no matter how overwhelming the tasks ahead seemed, James felt a deep sense of pride. He had gone from being the overlooked programmer in a small startup to being the face of a revolution in the investment world. He wasn't just proving his worth anymore. He was proving that the future was full of possibilities, if only one had the courage to chase them. As he sat in his office, reflecting on how far he had come, Hannah walked in, a bright smile on her face. "You did it," she said, placing a cup of coffee on his desk. "I knew you would." James looked up, his smile matching hers. "We did it. This wouldn't have been possible without you." Together, they had built something that would change the industry forever. And together, they would continue pushing forward, facing whatever challenges came next. James knew that this was just the beginning. The world was watching, and the competition would only grow fiercer. But for the first time in his career, he felt confident. The obstacles that had once seemed insurmountable were now just stepping stones towards something greater. He had already defied the odds, and now it was time to build on that success, to take his vision and make it even bigger. The future was bright, and this time, nothing, not even the barriers others had set up for him, would stop him. The first few weeks after the successful demo and the influx of investment were a blur of activity. James found himself constantly on calls, drafting plans, and working late into the night to ensure the next steps for his app would be executed flawlessly. It felt like a new phase of his life had begun, one in which he was no longer just the overlooked programmer. He was the face of a company that had the potential to change the way startups and investors interacted. But even with all the excitement and growth, James quickly realized that success came with its own set of challenges. The workload had doubled, if not tripled. The expectations placed on him by his investors, his team, and even himself were growing higher by the day. One morning, as he sat at his desk, reviewing financial projections for the next quarter, his phone buzzed again. It was Mark. James picked up the call quickly, hoping for more positive updates. "James, we've got a meeting with a major partner." Mark's voice came through clearly. "They're interested in integrating our platform with their service. They're a big player in the finance sector, and this could push us to the next level. We need to be ready. Are you?" James's heart raced. This was the kind of partnership that could turn his startup from a niche app to a major player in the industry. But the pressure it would bring could be overwhelming. "Absolutely," James said, taking a deep breath to steady his nerves. "I'll make sure everything's ready for the meeting. Can we meet beforehand to go over the pitch?" "Of course," Mark replied. "Let's do it tomorrow morning. Get some rest, James. You've earned it." James hung up the phone, his thoughts racing. A partnership with a company in the finance sector meant expanding his platform's capabilities, pushing the team to innovate even faster. It was an incredible opportunity, but it also meant even higher stakes. He glanced at the clock. It was already past midnight. The next few days would be grueling, but he couldn't afford to let the team down now. They had worked too hard to get to this point. The next morning, James met with Mark and the other members of his team in the sleek, modern conference room. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. As the potential partner walked in, James stood up and extended his hand. The lead representative from the finance company, a sharp-looking woman in her 40s named Erica, smiled politely as she shook his hand. "James, it's a pleasure to meet you. We've heard a lot about your app. It's clear you're doing something big." "Thank you," James replied, his voice steady. "We're excited about the possibilities of partnering with your company. Our platform is designed to streamline the funding process for startups, and we believe it could integrate seamlessly with your service." Erica nodded and sat down, her eyes scanning the room. "I've gone through your product with my team, and I must say we're impressed. The real-time matching is great, but we're interested in something more. We need a feature that allows investors to track the progress of the startups they've funded, something that can give them real-time updates about their investments." James took a moment to process what she was saying. It wasn't a request he had anticipated, but it made sense. Investors would want more than just an initial connection. They would want ongoing insights into the companies they backed. "That's definitely something we can add," James said, after a brief pause. "We could integrate a dashboard that provides real-time analytics on the startup's progress, their milestones, and investor returns. We'd need some time to develop it, but it's definitely doable." Erica's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "That's good to hear. We'll need you to move fast, though. If we're going to make this partnership work, we need to see results within a few months. We're looking for exclusivity in this sector, so we need to know you're the best at what you do." James nodded, his confidence growing. "We can deliver. We'll get the updates to you as soon as possible. And I believe that once we're integrated into your system, we'll be able to make a real impact on your investors' experience." Erica exchanged glances with her colleagues before turning back to James. "All right, let's move forward. We'll need to have a detailed proposal, including timelines for development by the end of the week. Can you do that?" "Of course," James replied without hesitation. "You'll have everything you need." As the meeting wrapped up, James felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. The partnership was huge. It could take his app to a level he hadn't even imagined, but it would also push his team to the brink. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility that was now squarely on his shoulders. In the days following the meeting, James dove headfirst into the task of refining the app to meet the new requirements. He held meetings with his team, prioritizing the new feature Erica had requested, and working late into the night to get everything aligned. The pressure was immense, and at times, it felt like he was spinning in circles trying to keep up with the ever-growing demands. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, staring at the new feature designs on his screen, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around to find Hannah standing behind him, a warm smile on her face. "You've been at this for hours," she said softly. "How are you holding up?" James looked at her, his face weary. "I don't know if I can keep up, Hannah. We're already pushing the limits of what we can do, and now we've got this new feature to implement. I'm not sure we have the resources to do everything at once." Hannah sat down across from him. "James, I know how much this means to you, but you don't have to do everything on your own. You've built a great team, and they believe in you. You just need to trust them. This is what you've been building toward. They're here for you." James leaned back in his chair, the weight of the words sinking in. He had always been the one to take the burden of responsibility on himself, always the one to push through on his own. But this time, it was different. This time he had a team that believed in him, just as much as he believed in them. "You're right," he said quietly. "I can't do this alone. I have to rely on them, on all of us." Hannah smiled and stood up. "You're doing great. Don't forget that. We're all in this together." As the weeks passed, the pressure mounted, but James's confidence grew. The app's new features were being developed, tested, and refined. The partnership with the finance company was moving forward, and everything seemed to be falling into place. When the day of the official launch arrived, James stood at the front of the office, looking around at the team that had made this all possible. The excitement in the room was palpable. It wasn't just about the app. It was about the journey they had all been on together. "We've come a long way," James said, his voice carrying through the room. "What started as an idea, a risk, has turned into something much bigger than I could have ever imagined. And none of this would have been possible without each and every one of you. So let's make today the beginning of something incredible." The team cheered, their energy infectious. As James looked at their faces, filled with hope, excitement, and pride, he realized that this was just the beginning. The future was bright, and with his team by his side, there was no limit to what they could accomplish. As James looked out the window of his office, the skyline of the city stretched out before him. The tech world was buzzing with the success of his app, and his company was poised for even greater growth. The journey had been difficult, but it had been worth every challenge. He thought about the long nights, the sacrifices, and the doubts he had faced. But most of all, he thought about the people who had believed in him: Hannah, Mark, the investors, and his team. They had all played a part in making his dream a reality. James knew the road ahead would still have its challenges, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was ready. Ready for anything. With a deep breath, he turned back to his desk and opened his laptop, ready to take on whatever the future held. The journey was far from over.